Welcome back, everyone. I literally just walked in the door from my quick 24 hours in New York City where I was filming for a TV show for the History Channel. I can't tell you any more than that. Kind of sworn to secrecy until they start advertising the show. Once advertising starts, I can tell you all about it, and I will definitely do that. All I can say is I'll be in multiple episodes, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And while I was preparing for all of that, I learned this story that is absolutely epic. And some of you may have already been familiar with it. I absolutely was not. It's a story of a woman named Olga of Kiev. Kiev being the Russian name, it's Kievan Rus and all of that. Of course, now I know Ukrainian name is Kiev, but Kiev is how it would have been known, I think, in the old days when Olga was there. That's what we're going to go with. This is from Biographics, and her story is nuts. It's absolutely nuts. She's a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church, but she's also a saint with a significant body count. And I'm sure we're going to get into that story today because she has one of the most epic revenge stories of all time. So the link is in the description to the original content if you want to check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
In today's video, we are covering our first saint worshipped by both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches.
All right, I got to take exception to what he said there about worshipped. I don't think saints are worshipped. Prayed to, perhaps? Worshipped, no.
For having first introduced Christianity among the Rus. These were a pagan people of Nordic descent who ruled over a vast land in the early Middle Ages from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But her holy title should not fool you, as she did not dedicate her life solely to prayer and converting the heathen. The saint was a ruler, the regent of the Principality of Kiev, and one of the most powerful women of the early Middle Ages. Most of her life is lost to the shadows of history, while the rest has emerged from the mists of legend. In today's Biographics, we're going to learn how this widow of a prince with an infant son defended her throne against insidious suitors, hostile tribes, and invading nomadic raiders. Most of all, we're going to hear the incredible story of how she avenged her husband with acts of escalating, ruthless cunning.
That is an understatement. When I tell you that this woman was calculated, cold, and epic in her revenge, that is an understatement.
Please welcome today's protagonist, Princess Olga of Kiev. Before I begin the story of how Princess Olga defended her family and her lands, allow me to give you some context. Who were the Rus people, and what lands did they rule over? The Rus, sometimes called Varangians, were people of Scandinavian ethnicity who had founded the Kievan Rus.
This is something important that I think we forget. I think often, at least in Western history, when we talk about the Vikings, we tend to think of their incursions into places like Britain. And sometimes we talk about France, and of course Normandy is founded by the Northmen, the Normans, but they're also really active in what is today Russia and Ukraine as well. And this is again something I didn't know a lot about, was the Viking origins of the Kievan Rus. But man, they had their tentacles in everything at this time.
Political federation that lasted from 862 to 1242. This state was located in modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. The capital of this federation was Kiev in modern-day Ukraine. Kievan Rus can simply be translated as the lands of the Rus of Kiev. Their Scandinavian origin was first mentioned by a Byzantine diplomat and eventual saint named Bertin, who first recorded their presence in his annals of 839. But
It's so cool that we have these recorded histories from this time period, a time period that I don't think a lot of people know about and a lot of people don't study about, but there's some really fascinating history. This is that time period when at least Western Europe is kind of transitioning from being Roman to being Frankish and German, and because further west than this, of course, and you have the Russian culture developing, and you have the incursions by the steppe people, and just so much going on here.
Most of the stories about the origin of the Rus comes from the primary chronicle, known also as the Tale of Bygone Years, an early
awesome
Russian
name.
text from the 12th century. According to the chronicle, the original dwellers of the area in the mid-9th century had invited the Rus, described also as Vikings, to rule and maintain order in their country. One of these Vikings was called Rurik, and he founded his own dynasty, which ruled over the area for more than 7 centuries. The
Amazing.
first Tsar of Russia, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan
Terrible.
the Terrible, was a direct descendant of Ruriks. The Kievan Rus, however, had ceased to exist as a political entity long before Ivan. Between 1237 and 1242, the Federation was overrun by the unimpeded advance of the Mongol hordes. The Federation
And
was
that's where we
divided
talk about
into small-
how, you've got changes happening in the West, but you also have things happening from the East. And, so much of what we understand today as being European comes from so many other places. And that's true anywhere, I guess you could say. And I was listening to a podcast by Dan Carlin today. It's a podcast about it's called King of Kings, and it's from like 8 years ago, but it's fantastic. And he talks about the problem we have when telling stories is where do you begin the story, because everything is connected. If you talk about the Kievan Rus, then you need to talk about the Vikings. And if you talk about the Vikings, you have to talk about what happened before that. And, you have to talk about all of these other things that made it. So at some point we have to decide where we start the story.
all disjointed countries, which eventually evolved into Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. But now let's get back to Rurik, because his bloodline is directly involved in our main story today. At an unspecified time in the second half of the 9th century, Rurik had established his capital in Novgorod, and his men had begun raiding the surrounding area in true Viking style, even going so far as attacking Constantinople. When Rurik died of natural causes, his firstborn son Igor was too young to rule and was put under the care of Oleg of Novgorod.
So he's cared by a guy named Oleg, and then Igor's going to marry a woman named Olga.
More campaigns to conquer and consolidate territories around Novgorod, Oleg moved the capital to Kiev to seize the enormous wealth amassed by two former allies of Rurik. In 912, Oleg died, and in a very interesting way too. A prophecy had foretold that his favorite horse would be the cause of his death. Oleg, a superstitious man, had made sure the horse was cared for as far away as possible from him. When he heard that the horse had died, Oleg considered himself free of the curse and mockingly kicked at the poor animal's skull. He chose poorly, though. A snake beneath the carcass was startled, bit Oleg on the foot, and killed him. In the meantime, Igor had come of age, and so he ascended to the throne, formally becoming Prince Igor of Kiev.
So with that story, I'm curious to know the origins of it, because it sounds to me like one of those things that got written after his death to help explain what happened. By saying, hey, this is what happened, but, there had been this prophecy. Whether it happened that way or not, I guess we'll never know.
By this time, he had already married a Varangian lady named Olga.
And she is hardcore. The trees. This is
Following in the
freaky.
footsteps of his father and his guardian, Igor continued engaging in successful conquests, raiding the neighboring territories and exacting heavy tributes to fill his coffers. But Igor was greedy, and he wanted more. In 945, he considered paying a visit to the land of the Drevlians, a local tribe which had been an ally to Rurik, joining his raiders in attacks against the Byzantine Empire. Later, the Drevlians had paid tribute to Oleg, but had stopped when he kicked the horse's head. Since then, the Drevlians had paid what was effectively protection money to a rival landlord. Igor saw this as a perfect occasion to collect some late payments and set off on his mission. According to the primary chronicle, he raided the land of Deriva and collected his tribute by violence. But on his way back to Kiev, he still felt a thirst for more gold and riches.
And this is such a great cautionary tale, is that know when enough is enough. And how many times in history have we talked about how in hindsight we look back and say, you know what, they should have known when to stop. Napoleon had those opportunities. Others have had those opportunities over time, where if you would have just drawn the line here, you might have survived and even thrived, but you just took it a step too far. And rarely do we know where that is. In this case, if he'd have just gone home, none of this ever happens.
He ordered his men to return home, except for a few followers. With them in tow, he rode back to the Drevlians, desirous of
Give me
still
more.
greater booty. Like Oleg, he had tried his luck one too many times.
Yep.
His returning party was spotted by Drevlians, who reported back to their leader, Prince Mal. The prince had had enough, proclaiming, "If a wolf come among the sheep, he will take away the whole flock one by one, unless he be killed."
Right, because what's to say that you give him more tribute and then he goes back and then he decides, I want some more. And this time he brings an army with him. So I kind of understand Prince Mal's viewpoint on all of this. It just doesn't work out so well for the Drevlians in the end.
If we do not thus kill him now, he will destroy us all. The Drevlian warriors then rode forth.
And here's the thing, too, and I'll say this as we get into the story, is that if they had just killed him, maybe it doesn't go down the way it does. So I can understand Prince Mal's viewpoint, but I don't understand why they had to make such an example of this guy.
From their city of Eskoristan, massacred Igor's soldiers and reserved him for a gruesome execution. I will leave the description to Byzantine chronicler Leo the Deacon. They had bent down 2 birch trees to the prince's feet and tied them to his legs. They let the trees straighten again, thus tearing the prince's body apart. With this threat deposed, the Drevlians planned their counterattack. They would take over
So, I mean, you can kind of picture this in your mind, right? 2 trees, they get bent down like this. He's tied between them, and then they snap back into place. And there goes Igor.
Kiev itself, not by conquest, but by marriage. Prince Mal ordered for some emissaries to visit the now widowed Olga to ask for a hand in marriage.
And this is the part that baffles me about this story. I just had your husband literally ripped in half by trees. Hey, do you want to get married? He underestimates her. I think what he thought was that this is a weak woman who is now in a weak position because her husband's been killed and her child is too young to rule. We'll take advantage of this situation. Let's unite our peoples together. I'll rule both.
It is not clear if this was a common habit at the time or if Mal was simply very arrogant. Back in her capital, Olga awaited for Igor's return in vain. By her side, she had her boy son, Sviatoslav, who was too young to fight, let alone rule. Mal's idea was that by becoming his stepfather, he could influence the little prince into doing his own bidding. So the delegation of Drevlians sailed a boat along the river Dnipro. Mal had sent 20 of his best advisors to put forward his proposal.
You'll see him smiling because I know what's coming.
Clearly believing they would be welcomed with open arms. This is when the primary chronicle, and our own story, centers on Olga. The princess sent her own emissaries to ask for the reason of the Drevlians' visit. They announced that they had slain her husband because he was like a wolf, crafty and ravening. They also said that Prince Mal was a good leader and that Olga should come to the land of Deriva and marry him.
Literally, the men who come with the message saying we just executed your husband also have to deliver the message and we want you to marry the guy who did it.
Olga's reply was what the delegation expected. In fact, she said that their proposal was pleasing to her ears, but asked for the delegates to wait on their boat and that they would be picked up the following morning.
And again, this is one of those situations where you have to listen to the choice of words. You know, like in the story a few minutes ago about your horse is going to cause your death. Well, not in the way he thought, but when he kicks the skull and underneath it is a snake. Same thing here. You'll be picked up the next day in your boat.
As the 20 Drevlians waited, Olga at the hall of her castle, prepared to give them their deserved welcome. The morning after, when the Rus came to collect the Drevlians, the latter demanded to be carried into the castle in their own boat. The Rus complied, as this was the same.
Now, my understanding is not quite this, and maybe there's different sources on this, but my understanding was actually that it was an offer by Olga's people to carry the boat as a show of respect, rather than them demanding to be carried in the boat, because she had already prepared for this the day before.
Same order they'd received from Olga. When they arrived at the castle, they found the surprise that lay waiting for them. During the night, the princess had commanded for a large deep ditch to be dug within the castle walls. The Drevlians did not have time to react, as the Rus hurled them, boat and all, inside the trench. The delegates protested to no avail, as Olga ordered they be burned alive. With her simple
Did he say burned alive, or maybe did I just misunderstand him? They were buried alive.
trap, the princess had wiped out a large part of the enemy leadership. This, though, was only the beginning of her revenge.
She is just getting started. Just getting started.
Prince Mal was unaware of what had happened in Kiev, so he was not suspicious of the message he received from Olga. She insisted that she was eager to meet, but she would only do so if Mal sent more of his own distinguished men to pick her up. The prince...
And she does this pretty quickly. She makes sure that the next step in her revenge process gets to Prince Mal before he can get word of what has happened to this initial delegation. So she immediately sends for this follow-up, and she continues with this ruse of, yeah, I'll marry you. Here's what I need from you to make it happen, though.
It is safe to say was quite a gullible man, agreed to it, and gathered more of his chieftains, warriors, and advisors to pay homage to the Rus princess.
I disagree that he's a gullible man, because if he's a gullible man, would he have done what he did to Igor in the first place? I think he's a greedy man who's blinded enough by his greed and his ambition that he doesn't see what's happening.
When this second delegation arrived in Kiev, Olga demanded that they bathe before she would give them audience.
And this particular delegation, this time it's like 200, and it's like the chieftains. It's like some of his higher ups. These are the aristocracy of his people. This is the leadership structure under Prince Mal. They're all coming in their best dress, and she says, hey, why don't you get a bath and get cleaned up before we head back to see the prince?
The Drevlians, surely tired, sweaty, and covered in dirt from the journey, eagerly complied and entered the bathhouse that had been readied. As they relaxed inside the sauna, they were startled by a sharp noise. Somebody was locking the doors from outside. Their attempts to force their way out were futile. In horror, they heard Olga's stern voice through the wooden doors. She had just given orders to set the house on fire. First by earth, then, by fire, the Princess Regent had sealed her first two murderous campaigns against the enemy tribe, with their leadership almost entirely decapitated.
Yeah, so let's recap here. Initial delegation comes, 20 men. They deliver the news of her husband's death. They're buried alive. She sends for 200 more, some of the cream of the crop of the leadership of Prince Mal's country, or of his realm that he rules. And she has them bolted into a bathhouse and burned alive. She's still just getting started.
But she wasn't done yet. Before Mal could become suspicious of the long absence of his men, she sent another message. I am now coming to you, so prepare great quantities of mead in the city where you killed my husband, that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast for him.
This is legit like the Red Wedding on steroids coming up here.
Mead was a popular alcoholic beverage in medieval times made with fermented honey and water. When they received the message, the Drevlians set to work preparing gallons of mead and a lavish feast. Olga arrived shortly thereafter with a small escort in tow. She arrived at Igor's tomb and asked her men to build a funeral mound around which the Drevlians gathered for the funeral feast. Some Drevlian, who was smarter than the others, asked what had become of the two delegations they had already sent, to which the sly Olga replied that they were on their way, escorted by her late husband's guard of honor. With the Drevlian judgment clouded by the rivers of freely flowing mead, they swallowed the lie very easily. Olga asked her men to wait upon the Drevlians, ensuring their cups were never empty. She waited patiently until they were all drunk, and at her signal, the massacre started.
And this is why did she wait for this, and why did she go to such great lengths? Well, a drunk enemy is an easier enemy to fight, especially when you're going to start a massacre on the scale that she is planning here.
Taken by surprise, her enemies fell one by one under the blades of the Rus. According to the Chronicle, 5,000 Drevlians were cut down at the Red Funeral.
The Red Funeral. I had never heard it described that way before, but super accurate. So now she's decapitated the leadership of this country. Now she's taken out 5,000 more. Only now is she going to go legit with this. She's going to go get her army and lay siege to this place. Yeah, and this is the best part to me.
A 5,000-man massacre still was not quite enough. Olga was bent on complete and total reprisal.
Can we keep in mind here that this woman is a saint in the church? She has been made a saint. The woman who did all this. It's a powerful story of redemption, I guess is all you can say.
And moving swiftly, the princess returned to Kiev and gathered her army. The boy prince Sviatoslav joined his mother, and together they marched back to the land of Dreva. He was just a child, but when his troops made contact with the enemy, Sviatoslav was the first to cast a spear from atop his horse. His arms were obviously too weak, and the spear barely cleared the horse's ears. Regardless, Olga's generals Svienelald and Asmund proudly announced that the prince had already begun battle and pressed the vassals to follow his example.
Symbolic.
The Rus charged forward and completely routed the Drevlians.
Because remember, at this point, the prince is technically the ruler of this territory. She's the regent. The prince is too young to rule on his own, and so she rules on his behalf as his mother. But it's not her country. It's not her realm. She's just running the show until he can take over.
The surviving men, women, and children of the unfortunate tribe sought refuge within the walls of their main city, Iskaristan. Olga and her troops besieged the city, but the Drevlians valiantly repelled their attacks. They knew that this was a fight for their own existence and would resist to the bitter end. In the meantime, other towns and cities of their lands had capitulated and were now living in relative peace with the Rus. They were, of course, paying their tribute. After 1 year, Iskaristan still stood firm, and Olga had to think of another plan to resolve the stalemate. One day, the besieged citizens received a message from the princess. "Why do you persist in holding out? All your cities have surrendered to me and submitted tribute, so that the inhabitants now cultivate their fields and lands in peace. But you had rather die of hunger without submitting to tribute." The Drevlians started to buckle and said that they would be glad to pay tribute, but they could not trust her as she was still determined to avenge Igor.
So here's the thing. Typically in this situation, if you have besieged a city for a year, there's not really going to be a surrender, because at this point they know that if you get in the city, you're probably going to wipe everybody out. That's typically what happens in this scenario. If the city doesn't surrender and they hold out for a siege, all bets are off, all decorum is off. When the besieging army finally gets in there, it's going to be pillage and murder and the R word and destruction and hauling people off into slavery and everything like that. So when they get a message from Olga that basically says, all right, I'll go with that, they're going to jump all over that. But do they really trust her? They probably shouldn't have.
Olga was apparently relieved to start negotiations with the defenders and let them know that she had considered her slain husband to have been already avenged, not once, not twice, but thrice. After all, she had already massacred 2 delegations, plus those who had attended the funeral feast.
Hell hath no fury like a woman whose husband was torn in half by trees. She ain't done yet.
In order to seal the peace, she demanded one last small tribute from the Drevlians, after which she would return home. Olga's request was surprisingly modest, as she realized that the city had been impoverished by the siege. She only wanted 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from each house. The Drevlians were elated. They collected the small flocks of 6 birds from every household and sent them to Olga, who promised to lift the siege the following morning. This was the last act of Olga's plan of total revenge and annihilation. If 1 year of frontal assaults and siege engines could not achieve victory, the intellect of a princess definitely could. And she would do so by turning innocent, harmless pet birds into a weapon of mass destruction. She ordered her soldiers to take 1 bird each and to attach to their talons a piece of sulfur bound in cloth. When night fell, the soldiers released the sparrows and the pigeons. Their silent wings carried them back to their nests under the eaves of the homes. One by one, the houses of Iskaristan were lit by fires. Soon,
she basically sends... So you got to remember, these birds, they have homes. They have nests that they've been returning to. And so Olga, in her wisdom, recognizes that if you release these birds, they're going to go back to what they know. And so they tie these little sulfur bombs with cloth around them, light the cloth on fire, and then allow them to fly back into the city where they've got wood buildings and thatch roofs, and it goes up like that.
The whole city was burning, its inhabitants either killed in their sleep or running in terror, unable to extinguish the flames. Some of them fled outside the city walls, but they were quickly seized by Olga's soldiers. She kept the elders captive, had some of the others sold as slaves, and many more were killed on the spot.
Yep.
This was the final and total triumph of Princess Olga of Kiev, victor of Iskaristan, scourge of the Drevlians, mother of sparrows.
I love the connections to Game of Thrones we have going on here. And understand, Game of Thrones is heavily influenced by real history. A lot of it from the Wars of the Roses in British history, but there's a lot of other places here too. I mean, this just goes to show you that there's really, in my mind anyway, and obviously being a lover of history, I have a particular bias toward this, but there are so many fantastic stories from history that we could tell that we don't need to make up stuff. I mean, how has this not been made into a TV series? It's incredible stuff. And people would eat it up. They would love it. I mean, so many stories from Rome. We got two seasons of HBO's Rome, and you could do so much more. There is a new Rome series coming out with Anthony Hopkins playing Vespasian that looks like it's going to be pretty good. So there's so many stories in history we could be telling that are amazing like this. And I say amazing, not that it's like, wow, awesome, but it's just crazy. And then she becomes a saint. Brings Christ
in the
to
following
these
years,
people.
until 948, Olga continued to act as regent for her boy Prince Vyacheslav. The Drevlians had been completely subdued and paid regular tribute to the Rus. The principality was at peace and grew prosperous. Finally, the princess set on a journey to Constantinople, or as the Rus called it, Tarsagrad, the city of Caesars. The chronicle does not offer a reason for this visit, but we can assume it was of a diplomatic nature. The Rus and the Byzantine Empire had...
Yeah, remember that the Russian word Tsar, just like Kaiser in German, is Caesar. That's where they get the name from. And by this point, Byzantium, Constantinople, as it's now called, and at this time is called, and then later in modern times, Istanbul. This is the center of the Roman world now, because the Western Roman Empire is no more.
A love-hate relationship characterized by raids and attacks by both sides, but also by trade and occasional cooperation. It was during this period that Byzantine emperors actually started to recruit Rus warriors to their elite Varangian Guard. In 948, the emperor was Constantine VII, who, upon meeting Olga, immediately took a liking to her. Impressed by her beauty and intellect, Constantine remarked that she was worthy to reign with him. We have learned by now that Olga did not take well to suitors, but in this case, her reaction was, well, less violent at least. The princess did not outright reject the proposal, but simply stated that being a pagan, she could not marry a Christian monarch. But if he really insisted, he could baptize her. The emperor agreed, and with the assistance of the Patriarch of Constantinople, had her converted into the Christian Orthodox faith. The chronicle reports that Olga accepted very eagerly the teachings of the church, like a sponge absorbing water.
And, you know, like in many of these stories of conversion, of course, the question is it legitimate? Like in terms of, does she really have a faith that is growing here? And it may be that that's the case, but there may also be a political component to this. She may see that there are benefits to identifying yourself with Christian Rome, or with the Eastern Roman Empire at this point, the Byzantine Empire, and with the other nations that are to the west in Central and Western Europe that are now all Christianized. It may be that it just made sense to do that.
At her baptism, she was christened Helena, and the emperor acted as her godfather at her own insistence. After receiving the sacrament, Olga, or Helena, was summoned by Constantine, who renewed his proposal. There was no obstacle now. She should become his wife. But she replied that this was not possible. He was her godfather after all, which made her his daughter in the eyes of the church.
Yep.
And, of course, it was unlawful for a man to marry his own daughter. The emperor considered her reply, then simply said, "Olga, you have outwitted me." He then covered her in gifts, gold, silver, and silks, and he bade her farewell. Olga had barely returned to Kiev when she received a message from the emperor. Apparently, those gifts were not entirely for free, and he expected slaves, wax, furs, and mercenaries in return.
There you go.
Olga was unfazed, and she simply replied to the Byzantine envoy that she would pay back her due only if the Caesar was willing to spend as much time in Kiev as she had spent in Constantinople. It is not recorded whether the emperor paid her a visit, so...
If I'm the emperor and I know the story of what has happened in the past, ain't no way I'm going to Kiev. Come on here. It'll be great. We'll host you. We have a great history when it comes to hosting foreign delegations.
So we will assume that he didn't, and she had outwitted him yet again. Now, as a recently converted Christian, Olga tried to spread her newfound religion among her people, starting with her own son. But Prince Sviatoslav was not convinced, fearing he would be mocked by his subjects if he did so. Olga accepted this refusal as her only defeat so far, but according to the Chronicle, she prayed day and night for God to forgive the heathen souls of Sviatoslav and the Rus. By 956, Prince Sviatoslav had come of age, and hungry for conquest, he built a valiant army and set off on several lengthy campaigns away from Kiev. When he was away, the land of the Rus was invaded by the Pechenegs, a nomadic tribe. They swept through the country and eventually attacked Kiev. Olga shut herself up in the city with her grandsons Varapolk, Oleg, and Vladimir. Now it was her turn to be under siege. The only chance of survival for the Kievans was to send a message to a relief force on the other side of the river Dnipro. A clever boy, whose name was never recorded, volunteered for the sortie. He could speak the language of the Pechenegs, and so he simply walked out of the city with a bridle in his hand, asking the nomadic riders if anybody had seen his horse. The ruse worked, and he was able to jump into the river and swim over to the other shore. The relief army soon arrived, and their general, called Pratik, convinced the leader of the Pechenegs that his was just the vanguard of a massive army led by Vyaroslav. These Rus were incredibly crafty, and apparently all of their foes were a bunch of yokels. The Pechenegs...
I mean, I wouldn't go that far. There's reason to believe that could have been the case, and they don't want to take any chances with that. Think about how many times, though, in history, the person who does great things for their nation isn't the most powerful, isn't the best strategist or general, but they're intelligent. Olga is smart. They've got some smart people in this realm. Caesar Augustus, same way. This is not a big, powerful, strong man who gets by because he's a great general on the battlefield, but he's incredibly savvy politically, and he's intelligent, and that goes a long way. Alfred the Great, who kind of has this dream of forming a united England, same thing. Weak, sickly guy, but super smart.
Next, they bought the lie and agreed to a truce. In the meantime, Olga had sent a messenger to recall the prince, who returned in time to decisively drive the Pechenegs back into the steppes. For many years, Sviatoslav remained in Kiev, finally fulfilling his duties of ruler in addition to his early honors as a conqueror. But in 969, he announced to his mother and his advisors, the boyars, that he had no intention to remain in Kiev anymore. During his earlier campaigns, he had established his base in the city of Pereyatslavets, where all his riches were concentrated. He said, "Gold, silks, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia, and from Rus, furs, wax, honey, and slaves." If that was the truth.
So it couldn't help but think about the fact that he mentioned the boyars here, because as we're thinking of revenge and stories like this, later when you have Vlad the Impaler, not too far south of this area and down in Wallachia, he's going to get revenge on the boyars who caused the death of his father and his brother. So it's all connected, even hundreds of years apart.
He had a point, but Olga was sad to see him depart once again. Now aged 70, the princess was in poor health and begged him first to await her death and then go wherever he would like. The prince yielded, but he did not have to wait long. 3 days after Olga had made her plea, she died. Her son, her grandsons, and all of her people wept for her in mourning. Olga had given command not to hold a funeral feast for her, as was part of pagan tradition. Instead, she had called for a Christian priest to perform the last rites in a subdued ceremony.
So it sounds to me as though this was, at least by this point, sincere on her part, her Christian faith.
It was her grandson, Vladimir the Great, who eventually converted all of the Kievan Rus to the Orthodox faith, but Olga was hailed by later generations as equal among the apostles for her role as a precursor to the widespread introduction of Christianity. In the primary chronicle, it is written that she was as the dawn precedes the day. She shone like the moon by night, and she was radiant among the infidels like a pearl in the mire. She was the first from the Rus to enter the kingdom of God, and the sons of Rus thus praise her as their leader, for since her death she has interceded with God in their behalf. Princess Olga of Kiev was canonized in 1547, officially becoming Saint Olga. She is probably the only mass-murdering saint in history, but I might be wrong on that one.
He probably is wrong, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. If you can think of one, let us know in the comment section.
The monarchs and popes have been canonized over the centuries, and these rulers can rarely have a career without getting their hands at least a little bit bloody. So I really hope you enjoyed today's video.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm guessing some of the popes, even just as rulers of the papal states, were responsible for a lot of bloodshed as well. So I thought that was a fascinating story. I think it's just an epic story of revenge, but also amazing how her later life turned out and how she's remembered today very differently than for those events surrounding the death of her husband. So let me know what you thought of all of that. If there's another story like this that you think would be fascinating to take a look at, let me know that in the comment section below as well. Thanks for watching.